evening. This is Monday, March 24th, 225 days until the 2008 presidential election, which will decide just how much larger this nightmarish number will become. 4,000. 4,000 American men and women in uniform who went to Iraq and never came home. All of them, in the vernacular of the White House, seemingly sacrificed not by the Bush administration for its conflict, but instead somehow having managed to sacrifice themselves. Our fifth story on the countdown tonight, a grim milestone reached with little accountability and a galling, repeated drumbeat today that they were all volunteers. President Bush usually letting it pass without comment when grim milestones come and inevitably go in Iraq. The U.S. death toll there reaching 4,000 late yesterday. 4 U.S. soldiers killed when a bomb hit their vehicle in South Baghdad. Mr. Bush noting their losses this afternoon from the State Department, saying the fallen have set the foundation for peace in Iraq.
One day, people will look back at this moment in history and say, thank God they were courageous people willing to serve, because they laid the foundations for peace for generations to come. That I have vowed in the past, and I will vow so long as I'm president, to make sure that those lives were not lost in vain. That in fact there is a outcome that will merit the sacrifice that civilian and military alike have made.
Vice President Cheney today implying that the military members of that equation have no one to blame but themselves. During another interview with Martha Raddatz of ABC News, Mr. Cheney saying the U.S. military casualties, to them, in effect, you volunteered. So, quoting him, we're blessed with families who have sacrificed as they have. The president carries the biggest burden, obviously. He's the one who has to make the decision to commit young Americans. But we are fortunate to have the group of men and women, the all-volunteer force, who voluntarily put on the uniform and go in harm's way for the rest of us. You wish nobody ever lost their life, but unfortunately it's one of those things that go with living in the world we live in. Sometimes you have to commit military force, and when you do, there are casualties who are no longer living in the world we live in. The decision to commit U.S. forces in Iraq, not exactly a have-to scenario either. At the White House, the president's press secretary also managing to absolve anyone in the administration from any connection to that verb, to sacrifice.
President Bush thinks that every single loss is tragic, from the very first several years ago to the ones that sacrificed yesterday. And he's extremely proud of the courageous men and women in uniform and all that they've done to help protect Iraqis, to protect each other, and to protect this country.
Proud, but not proud enough to allow any photographs of flag-draped coffins returning from Iraq, a ban still vigorously enforced by the Pentagon. Ms. Perino saying that Mr. Bush, who claims not to base his decision-making on public opinion regarding Iraq, is merely following the wishes of the families of the fallen.
Most of the families of the fallen that he meets with have one request of the president, which is, do not let my loved one's sacrifice be in vain. And the president assures them that he is committed to staying and fighting and winning.
Aren't there also families of the bereaved who ask him to stop the war?
There have been, but the vast majority have all asked him not to allow that sacrifice to be in vain. But certainly there are some.
Can you say that with certainty?
He has said that repeatedly, and that is true for the, I think, almost to nearly 1,000 families of the fallen that he's met with.
Operative phrase that he's met with. Gold Star mothers like Cindy Sheehan and others for whom this war have meant only tragedy and waste, having been denied any chance of making their requests of this president. Ms. Perino also addressing the fallacies on which this war was sold to us more than 5 years ago.
There's no doubt that Saddam Hussein was a state sponsor of terrorism. What we know is that Al-Qaeda has decided to make Iraq the central front in their war on terror. And we are fighting them there so that we don't have to fight them here.
Freudian secretarial slips aside, Al-Qaeda never having been in Iraq, not even in franchise form, until after the U.S. invaded. Yet to hear the top U.S. commander in Iraq tell us the biggest threat in that country now would seem to be Iran. General David Petraeus, who spent the morning briefing President Bush and will again brief Congress on the 8th of next month, telling the BBC that he believes Iran was behind yesterday's attack on the Green Zone in Baghdad. Time now to call in our own Richard Wolff, senior White House correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
General Petraeus managing to raise the prospect again of military confrontation with Iran about this. If anyone might be wondering how exactly his April testimony will distinguish itself or improve upon the September version, did we just get the answer? Should we expect more saber rattling against Iran and very little about Iraq?
We should always expect more saber rattling because there's very little else the administration can do, and it's done it before when it felt that Iran was maybe meddling more than it currently is in Iraq. But I think the real question is why the saber-rattling now? And there are two answers to that. First of all, maybe the security gains from the so-called surge are not as actually secure as the administration has been presenting. And certainly the upswing in violence that Petraeus was talking about is a sign that this may be actually a much more tenuous situation than the White House would have us believe. And the second reason comes back to this whole sorry attempt 5 years after the invasion to come up with a justification for the war. And if you are still, as the president does, believing that this is really about regional security, about remaking the region, then of course you're going to talk about Iran, because plainly anyone can see that Iraq is not safer now in terms of America's national security than it used to be. So this is a rationale, another rationale for this war.
It's been 15 months since the president announced the so-called surge, and we've got word now from the LA Times that the scheduled summer drawdown of the forces timed to when already extended tours would end. It might be paused. That would mean at least 140,000 troops would stay in Iraq through the end of President Bush's term. 140,000 was the figure in January 2007. So there are no troops coming home in the understood meaning of that phrase, are there? No, there are troops rotating in and out, but that doesn't make great headlines. Look, of course, any troops coming home is good news for their family and a much-deserved rest after the appalling exertions of these tours of duty. But overall, you can't take the timeline as set when the president made the decision to announce the surge. What really matters is the overall arc of the war and the overall state of America's national security, not so much even about Iraq's stability. So, yeah, what matters is the overall number, what it was at the start, which was 0, and what it is now. About Mr. Cheney, anybody thinking those repeated uses of the words volunteer, voluntarily was some sort of inadvertent happenstance? He also used the phrase all-volunteer force at a roundtable today in Israel. So he's not only trying to get this message across that any service member who died, any of the 4,000 who sacrificed ultimately, assumes the blame for having volunteered in the first place, but as if their families are not suffering enough, today he decides that he has to explain that the president carries a bigger burden than the families do?
Yeah, it's very curious phrasing, and the vice president uses so few words that each one is very carefully weighed. I don't know how an all-volunteer force makes the deaths any easier to bear or even less politically controversial. What really matters, as Dana Perino said, is what the families are asking for, which is not to make sure that these people did not die in vain. And unfortunately, what that really comes down to is, was the war worth it? On that, we've seen not just public opinion, but every serious analyst of the region, every government in the region say that this has been a complete catastrophe. So it's a depressing construction that the vice president has used, but what's really bad is that there's still no clear exit strategy.
Indeed. Richard Wolff of MSNBC and Newsweek on the occasion of this grim milestone. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Keith.
Here is a new one. What would you say to a presumptive Republican nominee for president / decorated Navy vet who says he is on the same side of any issue as is Osama bin Laden? Not exactly how one might have expected the death toll milestone in the campaign trail to merge on the campaign trail today, but Senator John McCain telling a group of vets in Chula Vista, California, that he and the leader of al-Qaeda and General Petraeus are all in agreement when it comes to the venue of the primary fight in the so-called war on terror.
For the first time, I have seen Osama bin Laden and General Petraeus in agreement, and that is the central battleground in the battle against al-Qaeda is in Iraq today. And that's what bin Laden is saying, and that's what General Petraeus is saying, and that's what I'm saying.
Last April, the senator had been taking a much publicized stroll through a Baghdad street market. Violence on the ground in Iraq now making a trip to that same market by Senator McCain just last week impossible.